For years, buying a telephoto lens was simple. You bought a 70 to 200 for portraits and events, a 100 to 400 for wildlife, or a giant prime if you had professional money. But in 2026, that old system no longer explains what telephoto lenses can do. Some now reach 800mm without needing a massive professional setup. Some replace multiple portrait primes. And one lens at the end of this list changed what photographers thought a fast pro zoom could be. So today, these are 10 telephoto lenses worth buying in 2026, and number 1 breaks a rule photographers accepted for decades. You are watching Alt Buzz Lenses. Subscribe right now so you never miss a guide like this one. At number 10, we have the Fujifilm XF 70 to 300mm f 4 to 5.6 R LM OIS WR. And before you skip past this one, thinking it is too modest for a top 10 list, stay with me. Because this lens solves a problem that almost every travel photographer has quietly wrestled with for years. Most telephoto lenses ask something of you before you even take a shot. They ask you to carry more, to pack a separate bag, to decide in the morning whether you think something worth photographing will actually happen. The Fujifilm 70 to 300 does not ask those questions. On an APS-C Fujifilm body, it delivers a field of view that reaches deep into telephoto territory, while staying compact enough to feel like a real travel lens, rather than a reluctant compromise. It goes out with you, and that matters more than most photographers admit. This is not the lens for someone who photographs birds professionally every weekend. It will not stop action in difficult light, the way a faster lens would. It will not satisfy someone chasing fast-moving wildlife at distance, and it is not pretending to. But this is the kind of telephoto lens that changes what you are willing to carry, because for once, serious reach does not feel like a separate camera bag. It is the lens that ends up in the bag almost by default, simply because it never felt like a burden to begin with. But portability solves only one telephoto problem. The moment the light gets worse, or the subject starts moving indoors, reach alone is no longer enough. At number 9, we have the Nikon NIKKOR Z 70 to 180mm f2.8. And the story of this lens starts not with a specification, but with a feeling most photographers know well. That moment when you look at your slow-kit telephoto and realize it is simply not enough anymore. f2.8 changes things. It changes how your subject separates from the background. It changes how the lens performs when the venue is dim, the reception hall is warmly lit but not bright, or the school gymnasium is doing its best impression of a cave. The Nikon 70 to 180mm gives more photographers access to the fast telephoto look, without immediately asking them to pay flagship prices or carry a flagship-sized lens. It is the lens that lets a photographer say yes to an indoor booking they might otherwise have quietly declined. It covers portraits, weddings, indoor events, small venue performances, and hybrid shooting with genuine competence. It is not Nikon's highest-end 70 to 200 option, and photographers who need the absolute premium experience will still look further up the range. There is no shame in that distinction. It simply means this lens knows exactly who it was built for. But for someone who wants f2.8 because they actually need it, this lens makes a strong and honest case. Yet fast aperture is only one part of professional work. The next lens is for photographers who need one zoom to survive portraits, weddings, events, and moving subjects. At number 8, we have the Sigma 70 to 200mm f2.8 DGDNO Sports. And this chapter comes with a direct challenge to an assumption many photographers carry without examining it: that serious telephoto work requires the lens to come from the same company that made the camera body. Sigma has spent years earning the right to sit in this conversation. The DGDNO Sports is not a third-party option you choose because you cannot afford the native alternative. It is a lens you choose because it competes seriously, handles professionally, and performs across the kind of varied work that photographers with busy schedules genuinely face. For Sony E-mount and L-mount photographers, this is a workhorse across weddings, events, portraits, indoor sport, corporate work, and hybrid photo and video projects. It is the lens that quietly shows up to every job without complaint, which is, in its own way, the highest compliment a working tool can earn. The camera brand may own the mount, but it does not automatically own the best value in your camera bag. The Sigma 70-200 f2.8 DGD-NOS Sports is large, and it is not available for every mount on the market. Some photographers will still feel the pull of brand loyalty, and that is a fair instinct. But loyalty should not be the only reason a lens stays in the bag. But for the photographer who shoots professionally and still thinks carefully about where their money goes, this lens belongs in the conversation before the native alternatives are even opened. But some photographers do not need faster aperture first. They need one lens that can handle a completely different kind of distance. At number 7, we have the Canon RF 100-500mm f 4.5 to 7.1 IS USM. And if you have ever stood in an open field, watched the sky at an air show, or waited at the edge of a safari vehicle wishing you had just a little more reach, this lens understands that feeling completely. Not every outdoor photographer knows what their day will look like before it begins. A subject that started 200 meters away may suddenly appear at 400. The Canon RF 100-500 is built for exactly this kind of unpredictability. Its appeal is not maximum aperture, it is flexibility. It is the ability to cover wildlife, aviation, travel, distant landscapes, safari, and outdoor sports with a single premium lens that does not ask you to predict the distance before you leave home. It rewards the photographer who shows up without a plan and trusts the lens to handle whatever the day decides to offer. The aperture becomes relatively slow at the long end, and this lens is at its strongest in daylight and solid outdoor conditions. In lower light, photographers will need to be deliberate about technique to keep images sharp. But for the photographer who wants one premium long zoom, rather than a separate lens for every distant subject, this one earns its place at number 7 with quiet confidence. This is the lens for photographers who do not know what the day will give them, only that something worth photographing will probably be too far away. Still, there are subjects that make 500mm feel ordinary. At number 6, we have the Sony FE 400-800mm f 6.3-8 G OSS. And this is where the list makes a shift that some photographers feel in a very specific, very familiar way. The shift that happens when you look at a photo of a bird and realize the bird is mostly crop. 800mm used to mean one thing: an exotic prime that cost as much as a car and weighed enough to remind you of that fact every time you lifted it. The Sony 400-800 changes that story. It brings 800mm into a zoom format that serious photographers can actually consider without immediately rearranging their financial lives. For birding, wildlife, aviation, safari, and distant action subjects, this is the lens that finally lets you meet your subject at its own distance. It is the difference between photographing a bird and photographing the idea of a bird from very far away. Some subjects do not reward patience by coming closer. This lens is for photographers who finally want to meet them at their distance. It is still heavy, slow at the long end, and demands good light and careful technique. A monopod or solid stance becomes less of a suggestion and more of a requirement once you are holding 800mm steady. But for Sony shooters who have been watching wildlife through a 200-600 and still wanting more, this lens represents something meaningful. Not just more reach, but a different relationship with the subjects you have been trying to photograph. If you enjoy gear guides that explain what a lens is actually for, not just what its specifications say, subscribe to AltBuzz Lenses. There is more of this every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next on this list. At number 5, we have the Nikon NIKKOR Z 180-600mm f5.6 to 6.3 VR. And the story behind this lens is really a story about a number that used to feel out of reach: 600mm. and what happened when Nikon decided to make it feel attainable. For a long time, 600mm belonged to a particular kind of photographer, the professional with a budget that matched their ambition, the wildlife specialist who had invested years into a system built around primes. The Nikon 180-600 changed that perception for Nikon Z users, giving photographers who were building their first serious long-lens setup a genuine option that did not ask them to start with a compromise. It turned a number that once felt aspirational into something photographers could actually plan a purchase around. The variable aperture means the best performance comes in good available light, and it starts at 180mm, so subjects that suddenly appear very close may require a different approach. It is also not a small lens, and photographers moving from compact telephoto zooms will need a moment to adjust to its size and balance. But the Nikon 180-600 is not a compromise for people who cannot afford a prime. It is a different kind of freedom for photographers who need reach more often than they need prestige. Even a 600mm zoom assumes you roughly know where the subject will be. The next lens is for photographers who never have that certainty. At number 4, we have the Sigma 60-600mm f 4.5 to 6.3 DG DNOS Sports, and this chapter feels different from every lens that came before it, because it is not about speed, and it is not about lightweight. It is about something more honest than either of those things. It is about uncertainty. Most telephoto photography assumes something photographers rarely say out loud, that you know, roughly, how far away the subject will be. But some photographers work in environments where that assumption does not hold. Motorsport photographers know that a car can be 50 meters away one moment and 500 the next. Airshow photographers know the same. Safari shooters, wildlife trip photographers, documentary workers, these are people whose subjects do not consult the itinerary before moving. They need one lens that can follow the story wherever it goes, without a lens change costing them the shot. The Sigma 60-600 is the answer to that specific problem. It suits fixed-position shooters, travel assignments, documentary work, and any environment where unpredictability is not an occasional disruption but the basic condition of the shoot. It is big, it is heavy, and it is not for casual users who only need telephoto occasionally. This is a lens you earn the value of only by working in conditions that genuinely demand its range. The Sigma 60-600 is for photographers who do not have time to decide which focal length they need before the moment happens. At number 3, we have the Sigma 500mm f 5.6 DG/DNOS Sports. And this is the lens that asks a question most photographers do not think to ask until they have carried a large zoom across enough difficult terrain to feel the difference. What happens when you already know the focal length you need? There is a certain freedom in commitment. When you mount a prime lens, you stop negotiating with yourself about which end of the zoom range you want to be at. The Sigma 500mm f 5.6 brings that clarity to telephoto photography at a reach that would normally require either a massive f4 exotic or a heavy zoom that adds unwanted weight to every step of a long day outdoors. There is something almost meditative about working with a single fixed focal length once you accept its terms. Bird photographers will recognize what this lens offers immediately. Wildlife photographers who walk long distances will feel it. It is a fixed focal length, which means you move your position, wait for the subject, or accept the frame you have. That discipline can actually sharpen a photographer's eye over time, rather than limiting it. But this is the lens for photographers who want 500mm to feel like a choice, not a physical burden. And once you accept that not every telephoto lens needs to be flexible, you can start asking a more ambitious question. What happens when a professional prime becomes a zoom? At number 2, we have the Canon RF 100-300mm f2.8 LIS USM. And if the previous chapter was about the freedom of commitment, this one is about the ambition of refusing to commit at all, about a lens that takes the idea of a fast professional prime and gives it a zoom ring without asking for anything in return. This is not merely a better 70-200. The Canon RF 100 to 300mm f2.8 reaches toward territory that used to belong exclusively to a 300mm f2.8 prime, the tool of sports photographers at major events and photojournalists working at speed. The difference is that this lens does not lock you into a single frame. It gives you the zoom ring, the flexibility, and the constant f2.8 aperture across the entire range. It is the rare lens that asks a professional to give up nothing in exchange for everything it adds. Sports, weddings, equestrian photography, fashion, news, and outdoor action. This lens covers them with the kind of speed and range that makes older professional workflows feel unnecessarily rigid. It is expensive, it is large, and it is designed for working professionals who genuinely use that speed and range in the field. For a photographer who bills by the job rather than the hobby, that cost has a way of justifying itself quickly. The Canon 100 to 300mm f2.8 is what happens when a 300mm prime stops asking you to choose one focal length before the job begins. But even this lens still follows one old rule. At number 1, that rule disappears entirely. At number 1, we have the Sony FE 50 to 150mm f2.GM. And this is the moment the list has been building toward. Not because this is the longest lens or the most practical wildlife tool, but because it does something none of the other 9 lenses on this list do. It breaks a rule that photographers accepted for decades without ever seriously questioning it. For as long as fast professional telephoto zooms have existed, f2.8 has been the ceiling. Photographers accepted it the way they accepted many professional constraints, quietly, because there was no alternative worth discussing. The Sony FE 50 to 150mm f2.GM is the alternative that finally arrived. It is f2, constant, across the entire range. In a telephoto zoom that wedding photographers, portrait photographers, fashion photographers, and event professionals can genuinely consider for their working kits. The kind of subject separation it produces is something photographers used to need a prime lens to achieve at all. It is Sony E-mount only, it is expensive, and it ends at 150mm, so it cannot replace a sports or wildlife zoom. Photographers chasing genuine long-range reach should look elsewhere on this very list. It is number 1 not because every photographer should own it, but because it changed what photographers thought was possible. For years, f2.8 was the rule for professional telephoto zooms. The Sony 50 to 150mm f2.GM is the lens that decided the rule was no longer enough. If you could own only one telephoto lens in 2026, would you choose speed, reach, portability, or versatility? And which focal range do you trust most? 70 to 200, 100 to 500, 180 to 600, or something even longer? Drop it in the comments. The answers are always more interesting than the specifications. The best telephoto lens is not the one with the biggest number on the barrel. It is the one that lets you reach the photograph without becoming the reason you miss it. Subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses, and we will see you in the next one.